In 2019, the Chang'e 4 lands on the far side of the moon, by this point sparking concerns from the United States of America. Previous spacecraft have seen the far side, but none have landed on it. The Chang'e 5 successfully landed on the near side of the moon and started sampling in 2020, followed by a successful return landing in Inner Mongolia with lunar samples. Half a world away, the USA finally launches Artemis. Some say Artemis launch could help NASA secure an early lead in the moon race with China.
I don't think we have to be intimidated by that in itself. We'll be the first, I think, country to put a person back on the moon. No one else has done that.
Let me just say, I'm a little disappointed that we're all getting giddy over going back to where we were 50 years ago. I just want to put that out there.
We just wanted to be sure. Nothing wrong with being sure.
Well, let's find out. Yeah, you got to go there first before you go there a second time. Okay.
NASA going back to the moon.
What we're going to learn living and working on the moon is going to help us. We were at a crossroads in NASA, just not going to make it to go back to the moon. On this schedule, we think we will land at the end of 25.
25.
That's our plan.
Is a 2025 moon landing realistic?
No.
Paul Martin is NASA's Inspector General.
That culture of optimism results in unrealistic cost and schedule projections. The first is the technical complexity of the mission. And the second, they do wonderful things, but they have less than stellar project management practices. At $4.1 billion per launch, you're going to be limited to one launch perhaps every other year. And that cadence of launches is not going to achieve NASA's mission of having a permanent presence on the lunar surface. So the dollars aren't going to be there. From fiscal 2012 through fiscal 2025, $93 billion.
Yes, space flight is expensive.
But any sort of competition is always viewed as a threat. Is China and Russia building the final frontier in space for wars of the future?
The race to space is heating up further. This time, there are two camps. One includes states led by Russia and China. Russia has traditionally worked closely with the Americans, even when relations were not so good on the Earth. But this time, they have moved closer to Beijing.
I mean, what's happening here certainly is Russia has great scientists and engineers. The Chinese will welcome that in addition to their own. Russia doesn't have the resources that China has, and they will certainly welcome that. And together, they'll work towards space exploration like we're doing and space research like we're doing. But I think the concern here would be they're coming together for another reason, an unstated reason, and that is to weaponize space. Our ballistic missiles pass through space. We have satellites up there that are prone to be taken out, and you can do that a lot easier from a space platform than an Earth platform. So it is a fact.
In terms of space, though, we're seeing increasing cooperation in two specific areas with Russia, and that's in the global navigation satellite systems, so GLONASS and Beidou, and also ballistic missile early warning. There's a certain synergy to be created there. The GLONASS system has slightly better coverage in the northern hemisphere, China's slightly better in the south. By creating that reciprocal kind of ground stations can benefit ballistic missile early warning, and Russia is committed to helping China build a space-based missile warning system, putting sensors in space. So I think we often see China as having the greater technological know-how, but we can't forget that Russia has a great deal of operational experience in space, and so there's very fruitful areas of cooperation there.
Does America, and specifically NASA, have the dedication and institutional wherewithal to meet the Chinese challenge?
It's half of 1% of the federal budget for all of NASA.
All of NASA.
All of NASA. Mars rovers, James Webb, everything.
Oh my God.
Yeah, okay.
Bert, let me just say, that is disgusting. Isn't there a way to take the billions of dollars that are going into making a fighter jet that we do not need, or tanks, couldn't we just find a way to shift this money over to NASA?
Well, NASA can't
lobby Congress. That's not actually allowed. So outside supporters can.
There seems to be a perception that the NASA budget is much bigger than it actually is. So let's compare. Annual budget was $23 billion last year. Compare it to the Department of Defense that has a budget of $700 billion, which is about 30 times bigger. Americans spend about $42 billion a year just to feed their pets. And then let's take Halloween. Halloween spend about $10 billion a year on Halloween. So I think NASA has a reasonable level of importance somewhere between Halloween and feeding your pets.
What does NASA do? They draft principles, a set of guidelines surrounding the question of how states will behave in exploring the moon and using its resources, in effort to extend its values to the moon.
And what the principles say is, our reasons for going to space are peaceful. When each other is in trouble, we're going to come to help each other. We're going to have commonality of instruments so that if we got in trouble, we could exchange. We're going to look to surfaces, the moon, and for peaceful purposes that can be used by all.
A number of countries sign up, not the Chinese, not the Russians. How do we want to deal with the moon as we start seriously thinking about potentially lunar industrialization, whether it is mining, whether it is oil processing, principles you have about ownership. No one can claim an entire celestial. Access to water on the moon, looking to see how the Chinese and the Russians respond.
China basically is uncomfortable with the US-led space order, and so since 2002, China has very clearly articulated its ambitions for the moon. It is not going to be a part of the Artemis Accords, also because the US government space agencies cannot collaborate with China because of the Wolf Amendment of 2011.
Some nations will see the U.S. as trying to impose their own quasi-legal rules. This could see the U.S. leveraging partnership agreements and lucrative financial contracts to reinforce its own dominant leadership position.
U.S. effort to create a NATO in outer space.
The Artemis Accord is not really an international legal legislation, and it's outside of the Outer Space Treaty. Russia is against the Artemis Accord. Russia is against the privatization of space because the Artemis Accord wants to encourage private companies to develop systems for lunar capability for the US and its partners.
China has criticized the concept of safety zones laid out in the Accords, and the head of Russia's space program has stated that the Accords are too US-centric to agree upon at present. Could the Accords be yet another instance of American exceptionalism? A power grab? The Artemis Accords give no indication of whether international cooperation will be an exclusive one like the International Space Station, which barred China from participating.
Presence on the moon is seen as offering China leadership and access. The country that actually has a presence on the moon, it will have the most important voice in how that particular regulatory framework will be established. If, for example, they establish a non-interference zone around their, say, research base, that means that if another country wants to land there, they will have to take permission from China, and that is something that I think the future we will have to deal with.
NASA is anticipating and planning against the inevitable onset of competitive, perhaps even commercial, lunar resource extraction and utilization.
I do think we will see moon bases in the not too distant future, and this is a first step. I think what we'll see is that we'll create an ecosystem where services are provided by different parties, and I believe there will be an economy in space to sustain this.
In 2017, they became the second place to make harvesting resources in space legal after the USA. iSpace was also awarded 2 contracts from NASA to collect lunar regolith and transfer ownership of the resource to the agency as part of the Artemis program to the moon.
The Chang'e 4 is only the beginning of China's ambitious plans for the moon and, ultimately, Mars and beyond.
There's a lot out there to explore, and this is the next beginning.